Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 1st of June 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
Before we begin with the discussion, here is a very important announcement for you in case you are confused about which optional subject to choose, how to find the best teachers, and where is the right kind of academic support for your optional papers, and above all, how to actually prepare for the same during these very difficult and challenging times. Then let me tell you that Rouse IAS has the best solution for your optional subject related problems. And for this very reason, we are going to conduct 3 live online counseling sessions in which Vikram sir is going to talk about sociology, Indrajit sir is going to talk about geography, and Paramjit sir is going to talk about history on 29th of May. These optional batches are starting from 4th of June 2021 via live online classes. Now consider this as a call to all those who wish to completely cover the optional subject by December 2021. Now this will ensure timely coverage of optional subject, and then you can focus your attention completely on prelims from January or February 2022. Now as you all know that Rouse IAS is offering guidance for political science, public administrations, history, sociology, geography, economics and psychology from Delhi, Jaipur and Bangalore centers, and all these counseling sessions have already been taken by our faculties on 22nd of May. The video of the rest of the sessions conducted on the same day are available on Rouse eLearn platform. Sign in to your free eLearn account and watch these videos available under video series Optional Counseling 2021. Let us now begin the discussion. Recognizing caste-based violence against women. In this particular article, the author claims that by repeatedly setting aside convictions under the Prevention of Atrocities Act or Prevention of Atrocity Against SC/ST Act 1989, courts bolster the allegation that the law is misused. Because whenever you have heard or read about this particular act, more often than not you have heard about how it is being misused in Indian context. More often than not, you have heard about how it is being misused against the people belonging to the forward caste or non-SC/ST people. And so this article presents us a very important opportunity to visit this very important act. Not only is it important for GS paper 1 under salient features of Indian society, diversity of India, but also under GS paper 2. Under laws and institutions and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of vulnerable sections, this is very important. And so in this particular discussion, we are going to first understand the necessity of this particular act. We know that a lot of constitutional and legal provisions exist in order to protect the people belonging to SC/ST community. Then why was there a need felt for a particular and a separate act which separately defines and deals with atrocities and not crimes? And here lies an important distinction between crime and atrocity. So we will look into the important provision of the act also, and then finally we will delve into as to why this particular act, like most other acts enacted to protect and for the betterment of the vulnerable section of a society, is actually failing on the ground. So to begin with, let us first understand that what caste system does. As a system, as an institution in our society, which is actually manifested in multiple forms in terms of deprivation of people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And these manifestations of caste system are not generally limited to just untouchability, but they are manifested in various economic, social and political domains. For example, caste system deprives the people belonging to SC/ST section and particularly the scheduled caste of the resources. It induces bonded labor and finally result in high level of indebtedness in this particular section of our society. Then look at cow vigilantism, which is used to describe the lawlessness happening under the name of cow protection. Now Dalits and Muslims are at the receiving end of this vigilantism. Since Dalits are concentrated in the occupation of leather making from hides of the cows and buffaloes, they are invariably targeted by vigilantes. Now cow vigilantism is a new crime. Although it existed, but its frequency has increased in last 1 or 2 decades. Then caste system and its assertion by upper caste leads to social and economic boycott of the lower caste and especially people belonging to SC/ST communities. For example, khap panchayats or caste panchayats often act as an arena for perpetuating atrocities against Dalits by ostracizing them or banishing them from the society. Now, apart from this, in terms of economic boycott, the people from upper caste refuse to deal or interact with people from lower caste in matters of business. They deny them opportunities, including access to services or contractual opportunities for rendering services for consideration. For example, people belonging to upper caste would generally not prefer a person belonging to lower caste as their cooks or as their drivers. They would prefer people from upper caste as well. And so this is a kind of economic boycott. And one of the most common crimes against people belonging to lower caste is honor killing. In a society like India, where caste structures are still dominant in the form of endogamy, honor killings are prevalent on a wide scale. And Dalits are almost always at the receiving end of the violence. So these are the manifestations of a caste system in terms of cognizable offenses, in terms of crimes which can be penalized or punished by the law. And now the obvious question which arises is that these crimes can be easily taken care of by already existing penal codes. For example, Indian Penal Code will obviously account for honor killing. Of course, it is a killing. A person has died or two people have died. And so it's a normal murder just like any other murder. But the problem is that more often than not, the crimes against people belonging to SC/ST section cannot be penalized by existing IPC provisions. For example, what are the general crimes apart from murder and beating? Oftentimes they are addressed in very, very offensive terms. So people belonging to upper strata of the society in the villages would address to these people in very, very offensive slangs. Of course, slangs can be penalized, but the provisions or the punishments would be very, very less in normal IPC. Then you must have read about news as to how the marriage procession of a person belonging to Dalit community was stopped by forward caste people. Now, of course, you can penalize them under IPC provision, but the punishment would be very, very minor, amounting to maybe 5 to 7 days in lockup. Then, if you forcibly shave someone's head, it could not be a grievous crime. But if you map all such forcible shavings taking place in our society, 99% of the victim would be from the Dalit community. And so that is why you needed an act which could punish such crimes not mentioned specifically in any particular act so far. And that is why in 1989, the Parliament of India came up with Prevention of Atrocities Against SC/ST Community. And here, you should focus on the word atrocity because it has not been mentioned prevention of crime against SC/ST. Although it is a crime, but it has been given a higher status of atrocity. Because atrocity is an extremely cruel act. It is higher than a crime. And so the act defines all such crimes committed by a person belonging to a non-SC/ST community or a person belonging to SC/ST community, not as a crime but as an atrocity. And so this is also one of the important provisions of the act, that the sections of these acts, the punishments, all of it are applicable only on the people belonging to non-SC/ST category. So what are the atrocities which can be committed or are generally committed by people belonging to non-SC/ST community on SC/ST? Causing insult and annoyance, as we have already talked about. Forcibly removing clothes, all these things are distinctly mentioned in the act itself. Denying the customary rights or access to public places, for example, temples and even roads. Conspiring to boycott people belonging to SC/ST community, which might result in social or economic boycott. Forcing SC/ST people to eat something which is inedible or obnoxious. Yes, these are also the cases which have been extremely well reported from the rural areas. Then of course, forcing a person belonging to SC/ST community to vote in a particular fashion or to not vote in a particular fashion, or wrongfully occupying any land belonging to SC/ST community or being cultivated by SC/ST community. And these are just around 60 to 70% of the provisions which have been mentioned in the act. There are other provisions also. For example, garlanding an SC/ST person with footwear or parading him naked or semi-naked. So now you can easily understand that why was there a need to mention all these heinous acts as a crime or an atrocity separately. If someone is insulting me as a person, as Vaibhav Mishra, it would not cause much trouble to me because I belong to an upper caste, I have a social capital of my own, and I can tackle most of these challenges. But abusing a person and a family consistently by a group of people, and that family feeling helpless, cannot do anything about that, is actually an institutionalized crime and atrocity. And so the Act defines punishments for each of these crimes. It starts from around 6 months and goes up to as max as 10 years. And there are other provisions in the Act also. For example, there is a separate section, section number 4 of the Act, which defines punishment for neglect of duties by the public servants. Because you need to understand that most people in offices of public service invariably belong to upper caste. And so they are also afflicted with the same kind of mindset and prejudices which the Act wants to fight. And so that is why you need to include them under the garb of the punishment as well. And so if any person who is not a member of SC/ST community is a public servant, and it is proven that he or she willfully neglected his or her duty under this Act, then there are stringent punishment for that particular person. Then there are enhanced punishment for subsequent conviction. But we also know that how our judiciary works and what are the kind of pendency which are being faced. And so that is why the Act creates special courts to try the prevention of atrocity SC/ST Act cases. And now it has been more than 30 years since the implementation of this particular Act. It's time for us to reflect as to what are the issues or the challenges with this particular Act. We are mentioning issues and challenges because in 2018, Supreme Court said that SC/ST Prevention of Atrocity Act is toothless. While ruling on Subhash Kashinath Mahajan versus State of Maharashtra, the court suggested that the Act is often misused by the Dalit community. Consequently, it recommended that prior inquiries be conducted before cases can be registered under this Act, and also made a provision for anticipatory bail for the accused. Now, all these matters have been done away with an amendment to the Act done by the Parliament, and so we are not going to discuss it. But now we are going to discuss the challenges being faced by the Act. And the first act is that this particular Act has been enacted to fight the caste discrimination, which we know is a very specific socio-cultural problem. Despite constitutional provisions to uphold the rights of Dalits in post-independent India, the systemic violence that has been perpetuated against them has continued well into 21st century. And so one of the shortcomings of country's approach towards welfare of Dalits is that the atrocities are mostly taken as a law and order problem, divorcing them from the larger strategy of social justice. And so we need to understand that prevalence of atrocity is a result of caste discrimination. And unless and until that goes, this particular problem cannot be solved in isolation. And for this problem to go away, all the provisions, not only in constitution but also in form of legislation, will have to act in unison. Whether it is about reservation to the people belonging to SC/ST community, whether it is about schemes pertaining to the empowerment of this particular section, unless and until those are going to bear fruit on the ground, this problem is not going to go away. Then next very important problem or challenge which this particular Act is facing is that the police guard the door to justice. When victim of caste violence tries to access justice, often the first stumbling block or hindrance they encounter is institutional bias in the form of police. They are simply not able to file the FIR. The police need to record their FIR first, which they are often reluctant to do, because most of the police personnel, most of the circle officers or SHOs belong to the upper caste. Or if not, they are highly influenced from the sections of upper caste. So that is one. Then most of the cases which have been filed under this particular Act have been closed subsequently, and this has led to the allegation that this Act is being misused by the people belonging to SC/ST community to file false cases against upper caste. But this is not true. The reason why there is a misnomer that this Act is being misused is that there are a large number of allegedly false cases that are registered under the Act. And this is also true only because the police are likely to classify cases filed under this Act as closed in their final report. It is the final report that decides whether or not the case is worth sending to the court at all or not. And compared to cases filed under other laws, cases filed under this particular act are more likely to be categorized as false cases. We know why. Because even if, let's suppose that FIR has been filed, but where will the evidence come from? Because by the time evidence need to appear in the court, they are already bribed into or coerced or forced into either eloping or submitting the false report. Then we obviously know that overall level of education is lowest in people belonging to SC/ST section. And so when education is low, of course the awareness about their rights is also low. And so the applicability of this particular act depends upon the awareness of the community with respect to the provisions of this particular act, which is very, very low. And so if the community is not aware about their rights under this particular act, why would they or how would they file the case, or how would they even know that what is being perpetuated against them is actually an atrocity or a crime? Then we have seen how it punishes willful negligence on behalf of public servant, but this act fails to define what actually willful negligence means. When will you categorize an act of omission or commission on behalf of public servant as willful negligence has not been defined in the act. And then finally, the special court which it talks about are not exclusive. Now, recent amendment has actually mandated the exclusive special courts to try the cases under this particular act, but that was done only as late as in 2016, not before that. And so that is also one of the biggest challenges in this particular act. And so these are the challenges of this particular act. Now, what we want you to do is that let us know in the comment section 3 important methods or ways through which these shortcomings can be overcome if these provisions are included in the actual act. Let us now move on to the next. It's time to define limits of sedition, says Supreme Court, appears on page number 1 and its continuation appears on page number 8. So yesterday Supreme Court has said that it is now time to define the limits of sedition, even as it protected 2 Telugu channels from any coercive action by Y.S. Jagan Mohan Reddy led Andhra Pradesh government for their reportage on COVID-19 pandemic in the state. Now, sedition is a very, very critical issue, not only dealing with the security of the state, but also dealing with the freedom of speech and expression of the people and citizens of our country. And so it directly gets covered under GS paper 2 under Polity and Governance. And sedition is one thing which always keeps on reappearing in news again and again. And so we are going to understand in this particular discussion not only the definition or the meaning of sedition, how it is penalized or punished under the Indian legal system, what have been the instances of misuse of sedition, the 2 important judgments of Supreme Court, mainly the Kedarnath versus the state of Bihar and Kanhaiya Kumar judgments, which have limited the scope of the sedition, and then finally, what are the arguments for and against the continuation of something which has been abolished by most of the democratic countries of the world. Let us now begin the discussion. So before anything, let us just first understand the meaning of the word sedition. Sedition is a very particular term which denotes an act which is an incitement of discontent against the government, or an act which leads to rebellion against the government. Or in other words, any action, especially in speech or writing, which promotes discontent or rebellion against the government. Now that is problematic even in a democratic setup, because in democratic setup, the Constitution of India lays down a procedure through which a government is formed. And it also at the same time lays down the procedure through which a particular government can be removed. Apart from that, various mechanisms being provided in the constitution and law provide for enough safety mechanisms so that the government actions can be challenged. And so it is safe to assume that a lot of checks and balances have been provided, not only within the institutions but also to the common public, through which all illegal and immoral actions of the government can be challenged and can be stalled. And so the idea behind the sedition law is that if so many mechanisms have been provided in the hands of the citizenry, there is no need for the citizens to rebel against the state or against the government. Now the problem over here is that there is a very thin line between the criticism of a government or a state and incitement of discontent or leading to rebellion. And that thin line is where the problem and issues of uses and misuses with respect to the sedition law comes into play. And let us understand how the wording of section 124A of IPC, which provides for the penalty against the sedition, comes into play. So section 124A of IPC creates mechanism to check sedition in our country. And you should be surprised to know that it was introduced by British Raj in 1870. Now the problem is not that it was introduced by Britishers, because a lot of laws which we use currently have been introduced by Britishers. But the problem is that it was introduced by Britishers in order to check the nationalist movement, in order to arrest and send the freedom fighters to jail. And that's where the problem lies. We are continuing with the law which was enacted to curb our own freedoms, and since independence we have still stuck to the same law which Britishers themselves have repealed. So let us now look at section 124A and see what it talks about. Whoever, by words either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation, or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India, shall be punished with imprisonment for life, to which fine may be added. So it starts with whoever, which means it is applicable to anyone. Then the actions being committed by that whoever person can range from speech, drawing, or any other kind of visible representation which either directly brings or which the state or the government thinks is attempting to bring either contempt or hatred or disaffection against the government established by law. Now these words are where the problems start. Although section 124 of IPC contains few explanations as well. So this explanation number 1 says that the expression disaffection includes disloyalty and all feelings of enmity. So whenever an action induces disloyalty in the citizens, the provisions of section 124 or the sedition can be applicable. But there are two other sets of explanation which try to put a limit on the misuse of the sedition law, which is comments expressing disapprobation of measures of the government with a view to obtain their alteration by lawful means without exciting or attempting to excite hatred, contempt or disaffection do not constitute an offense under this section. And similarly, criticism of administration through lawful means shall not be considered as sedition. So which means that, let's say there is a scheme, Atmanirbhar Bharat, a journalist publishes an article criticizing measures taken by the government of India in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that criticism, as well as if the journalist or the writer of the article suggests some alteration in the policy, and since she is doing it through lawful means, which means that the article nowhere suggests the replacement of the government, it just talks about alteration of the policy or government policy or the administration, it shall not be counted in sedition. So now the cursory reading of this particular section, the provision against sedition, will lead you to believe that everything is good and there is no problem, and so why the fuss? And to judge the efficacy of any law, you have to look at its applications. And now let's see few of the prominent cases in past 10 years and see how in reality the provisions of the section 124A have been used by various state governments. Starting with arrest of Assam Trivedi in 2012. So cartoonist Assam Trivedi was arrested in 2012 because he had published few cartoons on politicians. Then in 2012 and 13, we know that a lot of protests were going on in Tamil Nadu against the Kudankulam nuclear power plant. And the sedition case was filed against almost the complete village which was protesting against this particular nuclear power plant. Similarly, recently in 2020, Amulya Leona was booked under sedition because she raised slogan Pakistan Zindabad along with various other countries' names which she took. Then many sedition cases have been filed against the protester demanding revocation or reversal of Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. So clearly we can see that as far as the use of sedition law is concerned, clearly dissent, criticism of government and questioning of politicians and government policies all of which are very fundamental to a democracy, have come to be treated as sedition by police. Okay, if this is the case, then let's see how many of these cases which are filed initially lead to conviction in the same offense. And so, the graph which you see on your screen shows the number of cases related to sedition filed across the country in a particular year, and which ranges between 30, and in 2018 it went up to 70. And so in general around 30 to 50 cases are filed each year dealing with sedition. Filing of cases are not important. What is important is upholding of these cases by the judiciary, that is leading to final conviction. Only then we will know that the sedition case filed by the police upheld the scrutiny of the judiciary. And if you see that data, it is dismally 1 per year. In 2016, 17 and in 18, 1 and 2 cases led to conviction out of more than 60 to 70 filed that year, which in itself shows that most of the cases which are filed fail to stand up to the scrutiny of the judiciary. And why is that? And that is because of the two important judgments. One is Kedarnath Singh versus State of Bihar, and next one is Kanhaiya Kumar case. The judgments given by the Supreme Court in both these cases act as a guiding light for judiciary in order to determine the case under 124A or the sedition law. So this particular case took place in 1962, where the Supreme Court upheld section 124A and held that section 124 struck the correct balance between fundamental rights and the need for public order. So the validity of section 124A was challenged, and it was proposed that it violates the fundamental right. But Supreme Court held that no, it does not. And in fact, it is a right balance between the need for a public order, we need laws to ensure public order, and fundamental rights. But the court had significantly reduced the scope of sedition law. And what it did is that it limited the scope to only those cases where there is an incitement to imminent violence towards the overthrow of the state. Incitement to imminent violence. So, any speech, action or publication which calls for immediate violent step against the overthrowing of the government or the state will attract sedition. Further, the court said that it is not mere against government of the day, but the institutions as the symbol of the state. So after this important judgment, now it has become clear that unless and until a speech which calls for immediate violent overthrow of the government of India or the state of India, except the police is able to demonstrate this imminent danger to the stability of the state, there shall not be any sedition case. And similarly, in Kanhaiya Kumar case, the Supreme Court redefined seditious act only if it had essential ingredients, and it listed out 3: disruption of public order, attempt to violently overthrow a government, or threatening the security of the state. And now you can easily understand that why, even though the number of cases which are filed are 50 to 70 each year, but only 1 or 2 of them lead to conviction, only because these 2 Supreme Court guidelines are on work. And now an obvious question which arises is that when the conviction rate is so low, why police even files the cases? And for that, we will have to revisit the provisions of section 124A. We know that this offense is cognizable and non-bailable. And so whenever the government is threatened by an publication or political opponents, as soon as the case is filed, bail as a matter of right is denied. And for getting the bail, that person will have to first knock on the doors of the judiciary. And so what is guaranteed is few days, weeks, or even months of jail term, or police or judicial remand. And that threat is used to stifle the dissent or free speech. And that is why so many cases are filed even though they do not lead to conviction. And hence, prominent public thinkers have argued against this particular seditious law and called for its removal. At the same time, we know that this law is here to stay and there is no proposed amendment for this particular act. And so we'll discuss arguments for and against sedition law. So the first and foremost argument is that it is against democratic norms, just for the simple reason that it was enacted by the Britishers against the Indian people. It, in its basic nature, in its core, it stifles the democratic and fundamental right of people to criticize the government. And more often than not, it is used just for the same purpose. Then the next argument is the inadequate capacity of the local police stations to be able to judge the merit of a sedition case. We know that the cases are filed by the police, and the police might not have the requisite training to understand the consequences of imposing such a stringent provision. They might not be able to understand the nuances of Section 124A. It is very difficult to understand the difference between expressing disagreement with the government policy or expressing disloyalty towards the government, and both can be mistaken, and so we don't have such capacity of state machinery. Then just for the simple reason that it has been misused more often than it has been used. As we have seen with examples, it has been used arbitrarily to curb dissent. In many cases, the main targets have been writers, journalists, activists who question government policy and the projects, and even political dissenters. Then, as the crime, as we have seen, is non-bailable and punishment can extend for life, it has a strong deterrent effect on dissent even if it ultimately does not lead to conviction. And finally, since this provision has been mostly used to gag the fourth pillar of our democracy, that is the press, just this simple reason that most of the cases have been filed against the journalist is a strong enough reason as an argument and a strong argument against sedition law. But it's not as simple as it seems. There are some very solid points which indicate or which, because of which, the sedition law is still in existence. So, against the argument that it is a draconian law, the people who argue in favor say that it is not really a draconian law anymore, because now we have Supreme Court guidelines which have narrowed down significantly the jurisdiction of sedition law, and it can be applied only on grounds laid down by the Supreme Court. So the draconian nature has been curtailed, and so there is no need to dilute or remove it. Then for all those people who say that this particular sedition law violates the fundamental right to free speech, the argument can be made out that Article 19(1) provides for various kinds of freedom, but Article 19(2) provides for reasonable restrictions. And if you see, safety and security of India and any law enacted to preserve that comes under the reasonable restrictions and will not be void of Article 19(1). And so, sedition law is actually an application of reasonable restriction provided for in 19(2). Then the argument that it curbs the free speech also does not hold according to some people, because the explanations given in Section 124A have made it very clear that one can use any kind of strong language in criticism of government policy, schemes and actions without inviting sedition. Such freedom or dissent should not be turned into some kind of persuasion to break the country itself. And so that is why it is important to have a sedition law. And then one of the strongest argument comes from the existence of anti-national elements. In our country, we have terrorists, Naxals, who not only incite violence against the government, but also produce literature which tries to sow the seed of disaffection against the Indian state. And so, due to the presence of anti-national elements and divisive forces such as Naxalites, separatists, it is important to have such a provision in law. And finally, for any law, the misuse can never be discounted. Starting from anti-dowry provision to provisions to penalize the murder, all have been misused, and mere misuse of a law cannot be ground for its repeal. And so in the mains examination, you could be expected to not only produce the arguments for and against, but also as a bureaucrat or as a future bureaucrat, come up with way forward or a solution. And so the way forward could be the continuance of sedition law, but incorporation of the Supreme Court guidelines given in Kedarnath case and Kanhaiya case into the law. So Article 124A should be amended to include the grounds given by the Supreme Court in these two cases into the Act itself. Then there is a need for sensitization of the police or police training. They should be sufficiently guided as to where the section must be imposed and where not. And finally, there is a need to include provisions where the government can be penalized if this particular section is misused. This will ensure that Section 124A of IPC strikes a balance between security and smooth functioning of the state, along with fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression preserved. So this particular topic of sedition becomes very important from the perspective of GS paper 2, where you could be expected to reproduce arguments both in favor as well as in against of sedition, and is there a need to continue with the same law. So you will first start with a very brief introduction as to what sedition means. What has been the controversial applications of this particular law which has brought this particular section into the news? What have been important Supreme Court judgments? And then arguments in favor, against, and then finally way forward. All of this compressed in 250 words. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The Indian model of coexistence appears on page number 7, where the author is talking about Israel-Palestine debate or dispute, and he traces the dispute in history. And then coming back to the present, he states that if two-state solution is nowhere in the offing, a single state after the Indian model, that is secular, democratic, pluralistic state, may be the only feasible option for the coexistence of Israel and Palestine, which is the Jews and Arabs. Now, the dispute between Israel and Palestine is not only very perplexing, but it is also very complicated. And in order for you to understand the claims of the author, you will have to first trace the genesis of this particular problem. And that is what we are going to do. We are going to first understand how this problem began, how the overall geography of Israel and Palestine has evolved in last 50 to 60 years, what is the current status, and why this dispute is in news since last 1 month. Let us now begin the discussion. And so in order to be able to understand what is happening right now, we'll have to go back in history to the time when there was extreme persecution of Jews, which resulted in the migration of Jews from Europe and various other parts of the world to Palestine, which led to the passage of UN resolution, which were followed by two important wars which were fought by Israel and Arabian countries, 1948 Arab-Israel War and Israel's Six-Day War. So now the current map of Israel and Palestine, which you see on Google Map or on World Map today, is something which did not exist 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, there were very few Jews who lived in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Most of them had already migrated to various European cities and countries. But the problem was that wherever Jews went, they had to face extreme persecution both from Muslims as well as from Christians. And hence a movement emerged among Jews living in European countries which took up the cause of persecution and talked about escaping this persecution. It actively talked about creation of a state solely or only meant for Jews. And this particular movement came to be known as Zionist movement. So basically Jews were persecuted in European countries. They decided they will gather, unite and move to location on earth where they will establish their own state which will be just for them. And the place which was identified by them was Palestine. And so once it was decided that Palestine will be the place where they will set up their own country, they started to migrate. But the question arises, how could this migration take place? Now they could migrate because of special situation which was created as a result of World War I. If you know the context of World War I, you know that as a result of it, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the most of the region of the Middle East, disintegrated as a result of World War I. And as the settlement of World War I, the administration of the Palestinian region was handed over to the British people. And you can see the Palestine in the red color marked over here, and you can see that under British, French and Russian protection. And this particular arrangement where British, French and Russian governments decided to trifurcate the whole region among themselves is known as Sykes-Picot Agreement. So two things happened simultaneously in favor of Jews. The disintegration of Ottoman Empire, an empire which claimed to be the protector of the Muslims. The existence of such an empire would have prevented the inflow of Jews to this particular region because it was controlled by a very powerful Ottoman Empire which disintegrated in 1915 to 16. And at the same time, the territory Palestine, which was identified under the Zionist movement will be the place where all the Jews will migrate, fell under the British occupation, and Britishers since the beginning were quite sympathetic to the cause of the Jews' protection and their persecution. But as soon as the World War ended, and a new set of governments started to form in Europe, another factor was added into the migration or giving a big boost to the migration of Jews from Europe to the Palestine, which was emergence of a lot of fascist governments across Europe. One of them, you know, is Hitler, another one was Mussolini. And so what you have across Europe is wide level of persecution which extended well beyond Germany. And so as more and more fascist and anti-Jews government rose up in Europe, the persecution of Jews reached unprecedented level not even seen during medieval times. And this resulted into the kind of migration which was never seen by Jews in the history. So now, starting with Zionist movement as reason number 2, disintegration of Ottoman Empire and occupation of Palestine by Britishers, and third is that now you have fascist regime which were actively persecuting Jews, which was unseen before. And so as a combined result of all these factors, the more and more number of Jews started arriving in a very small territory of Palestine, which was earlier mainly populated by Arab Muslims. And so what you have till 1947 is that this Palestinian territory is just receiving more and more number of Jews flowing in from Germany, from Sweden, from France, and from various other places in Europe, and they are just arriving and making up their own homes inside Palestine. Because this particular territory is controlled by British, they are allowing the people to come in. But by the time 1947 and 1948 came, a massive alarm was raised by local Arabs, because now they were concerned about the increasing population of Jews, and they started an armed militant movement against the immigrants or the Jews. And so this of course resulted in a retaliation from Jewish side, and this led to a lot of violence in the one particular year from 1947 to 48. But now it is 1947-48 and World War II has already ended. And now the Britishers had made up their mind to vacate the Middle East, including the Palestinian region. And so they decided to establish a proper state which the world would recognize as Israel, or nation state for Jewish people. And hence United Nations Security Council passed a resolution in which voted to split the earlier Palestinian region into 3 states. One Arab state, another one Jewish state, and the third one would be the Jerusalem city. And so this UN resolution was passed in 1947, and this resolution is known by the name of UN Resolution number 181. And so now is the time to understand how the map of Palestine changed after this particular resolution. So you can clearly see that there are 3 colors in this map. Blue denotes the Jewish regions, pinkish orange color denotes the Arab regions, and the yellow one is international city of Jerusalem. So this was the condition starting 1948. And so this was the first time when the boundaries were actually drawn in the state of Palestine. So earlier what you had was complete Palestine owned and possessed and populated by Arabs. But after the resolution, what you have is a trifurcation of the same state into 3 parts. You can see clearly that Jews were given a lot of territory and Arabs were made limited to just the orangish areas. And so this was the first time when the Jews got the legal right, recognition from across the world, to make up their own home state or home nation. So as you can totally understand, it's quite commonsensical what would have been the reception of this UN resolution. It was wholeheartedly accepted by Jews because since 100 years there was a demand among the Jews for their own home state, which they finally got through UN resolution number 181. But as far as Arabs are concerned, they completely rejected the UN resolution. It's not difficult to think why the response was such, because the earlier territory which completely belonged to them, 50%, more than 50% of that was given to Jews. And so they not only rejected the UN resolution, but at the same time they said that any further talks would not be entertained and we are going to fight it back and take it away from the Jews. And so here now what you have is genesis of one of the world's most cluttered and disputed territories. When the Arabs rejected the United Nations resolution, they also promised with each other that they are going to win back the areas which have been given to the Jews, which resulted in a lot of wars. But we are going to keep ourselves limited to 1948 Arab-Israel war and Israel's 6-day war, because these are the 2 wars which have resulted into drastic changes in the map of the Israel and Palestine, and these are the locations which are frequently asked in UPSC Prelims examination. And through this discussion you will understand the importance of each and every territory. So in 1948, following the declaration of the State of Israel, the group of Arab nations known as Arab League decided to intervene on behalf of their Palestinian brothers by ordering their troops and military to marching into the areas of Palestine, especially those areas which were given to the Jews. Overall, the war was quite prolonged, but Israel emerged victorious because it not only retained its own mandate, it not only retained the territories which were allocated to it through UN resolution, but it was also able to capture around 60% of the territory which was given to the Arab people. So now after the end of this war, the Jews extended their area of control within Palestinian region. And so for next 10 to 15 years, things remained almost the same until in 1967 when Israel fought Six-Day War with its surrounding neighbors, which was actually started by Israel because Israel had this kind of premonition that the neighboring states are going to attack it. And so Israel started conducting preemptive strikes on Egypt, Syria and Jordan. And the interesting outcome of the war was not just that it defeated the combined armies of Egypt, Syria and Jordan, but Israel also managed to get control over some of the most strategically important points in Egypt, Syria and Jordan, which would then go a long way in defending Israel in future. So for example, it captured completely Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. It took away Golan Heights, which are located over here, from Syria, and then it took West Bank, which can be seen marked in the blue color over here, and East Jerusalem from Jordan. So before the beginning of the war, Israel was just limited to the area which I am shading in blue color. It did not have Gaza Strip, it did not have Sinai Peninsula, it did not have West Bank, it did not have Syrian region of Golan Heights, which are very, very important strategically to protect Israel from Syria. But after the war ended, the Israel had access to Suez Canal through Sinai Peninsula. It completely controlled West Bank, Gaza Strip and also the Golan Heights. Now of course the current map of Israel does not show Sinai Peninsula as a part of Israel, and so that is because Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in response to Egypt becoming the first Muslim country to recognize the existence of Israel as a formal state. So that was like a quid pro quo. You recognize us and we'll give back your territory to you. But it has held on, stuck to the other territories even now. It still controls Gaza Strip and West Bank. It still controls most of the Jerusalem. Now, whenever you read the news about Israel and Palestine, this is the one term because of which the news appears, and that is called the settlements of Israeli people in Palestine. So what are these settlements? Of course, the Jewish people are settling in this particular region since more than 80 years now. And so what is this new stuff known as settlements? So settlements are basically civilian establishments for Jews, but they are known as settlements. There is a particular term, settlement, is used only for those colonies which are built on land occupied by Israel after 1967 war. So if you make a house or a home or a colony inside this particular region, there is no trouble. But we know that in 1967, Israel occupied and started controlling the West Bank as well. And so what Israel does is that it comes up with new colony here, expelling the Arabs from that particular region. And this has seen a continuous upswing in past 10 years, especially with the election of Mr. Netanyahu, who has been extremely nationalist in his outlook and approach towards the Arab people. So now this is a clear violation of UN resolution, because the UN resolution limited the Jews only to the region which was allocated to them. But now these Jewish people have started to make their homes inside the Arabian territories as well. And so now what you see on the screen is a gradual transformation of Israel's ethnicity in terms of the occupation. And so the light green color in the dark background shows the continuous reduction in the area populated by Arabs, and you can see a drastic decline after 1960, because then in 1970 onwards Israel's national government started to take up the colonies earlier settled by Arab people, expelled them because they have brute force on the ground, and now they are making up territories, colonies and occupations inside the Palestinian lands. So these settlements have led to a lot of violence in this particular region. So that is the reason number one because of which we hear the news related to Israel and Palestine. Now the reason because of which in last 10 days Israel has appeared in the newspaper is because of the clashes taking place at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. And it sits on a plateau which is also the holiest site for Jews, who refer to it as the Temple Mount because it was the location of biblical temples. Romans destroyed the second temple in 70 AD with only the western wall remains. And the mosque was of course built much later. And so what you have right now, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then you have a wall which is the holiest site for Jews. And in recent years, groups of religious and nationalist Jews escorted by Israeli police have started to visit the compound or this campus in greater numbers, and they have started to hold prayers in defiance of the rules which was signed in 1967. Now, Palestinians view the frequent visit by Israelis as an attempt to ignite violence. The Palestinian view is that more and more Israelis will start visiting and they will eventually take over the control over their one of the holiest mosques across the world, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is also one of the only few places still not controlled by the Israeli people. Because this particular location containing both Al-Aqsa Mosque and the wall is under the custody of neighboring country Jordan. The site is open to tourists during certain times, but only Muslims are allowed to pray there, and the western wall is the holiest site where the Jews can pray. And now, since the Jewish police has started to visit this particular region, the Palestinians and the Arabs are now increasingly concerned about the increasing control of the Israel on their holiest site. The next news appears on page number 8. Defense Ministry notifies 108 negative imports. And so, continuing with its series of policy interventions to reduce India's dependence on foreign military equipment, the Defense Ministry has announced a second negative list or second negative import list of around 108 items. The list mentions weapons, platforms, ammunition, and other military equipment, including some light helicopters and corvette warships, that will be banned for imports starting December 2021 in a progressive manner. And so that is what is essentially negative import list means. Government wants more and more defense indigenization. For that, you need to clearly replace them from the exports. And so first you will have to ban them so that our defense establishment is left with no other option but to purchase or procure it from the domestic manufacturers. The only change is that from negative import list, this time notification defines them as positive indigenization list. We know that India has been one of the largest importers of weapons in the world for over a decade, and the government intends to encourage the domestic defense manufacturing industry. And so that is why a lot of steps have been taken. One of the steps is negative import list. For example, India is not going to import any tanks from December 2021. Other items in the list include helicopters lighter than 3.5 tons, single engine land variant, wheeled armored platform, next generation corvette warships, AWACS systems or airborne early warning and control systems, which act as eye in the sky, which is like a flying radar. And so out of 1.3 lakh crore allocated for capital acquisition for defense in this year's budget, the government has reserved more than 60%, that is more than 70,000 crore has been reserved for domestic procurement. And it is not necessary that these manufacturers have to be public sector undertakings, but they could also be a private sector company, but that should be domestically manufactured. And so many of the items in the negative list are already being produced in India, while some of the items are under development by domestic industry and are not produced by any other country, like light combat helicopter and light transport aircraft, while some of the other items like AK-203 are being produced domestically by Indian public sector undertaking in collaboration with foreign firm. Last item for today's discussion is an image appearing on page number 1. A newborn rhino with its mother at Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary in Morigaon district of Assam. We know how these protected areas are very, very important from the perspective of prelims examination. And so we are going to just focus on two things. First is about Pobitora and its location, why it is famous. And so it is a wildlife sanctuary on the southern bank of Brahmaputra river in Morigaon district of Assam, and it is important because it holds one of the largest Indian rhinoceros population in Assam. Now the success of these protected areas can be gauged not just from the increasing population of tigers in respective tiger reserves, but just look at the numbers in case of rhinos also. Just in Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary, there are now around 102 rhinos, which is a massive 10% increase over the last 6 years period. Pobitora has also exceeded its rhino bearing capacity and now it's overpopulated. and the animals have now begun to move outside the sanctuary in search for food, and chances of serious man-animal conflict are quite rife or prevalent. Under the Rhino Vision 2020, which is a joint program of Department of Environment and Forest, Government of Assam, WWF India, 6 rhinos were translocated from Pobitora and reintroduced into Manas National Park. And so in the same breath, let us now look at important protected areas in Assam. We have Dibru-Saikhowa National Park up in the north, where the Brahmaputra River enters the plains of Assam. Then we have Kaziranga National Park. Then we have Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary. And although not marked on the map, somewhere over here you have Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary. Then of course you have Orang National Park and Manas Wildlife Sanctuary and National Park. Let us know in the comment section which of the mentioned encircled sites are also the tiger reserves. So this is the end of today's discussion. Let us now move on and look at the question of the day.